What does a beautiful future look like to you?
You can flip a negative mood on its head.
This was a talk that was all over the place, but then New York, you are all over the place.
There are experiences that you just don't get anywhere else.
From the virtual stage of the 92nd Street Y, hello and welcome to our civic series, Race to City Hall. My name is Seth Pinsky and I'm the CEO of the 92nd Street Y. I'm honored to be here to host these one-on-one conversations with leading mayoral candidates covering topics of importance to all New Yorkers, including some topics suggested by members of our 92nd Street Y community. Thank you all so much for joining us. As we all know, the last year has been an incredibly difficult one for our city. To overcome our challenges, New York is going to need a decisive, collaborative, and creative chief executive. It's for this reason that we at the 92nd Street Y have launched this series. Today, I'm speaking with mayoral candidate Kathryn Garcia. For the 14 years prior to entering the race, she held a variety of roles in New York City government under mayors Bloomberg and de Blasio. These included Chief Operating Officer of the Department of Environmental Protection and Commissioner of the Department of Sanitation. During her time in the de Blasio administration, she was also asked on several occasions to take on special assignments on behalf of the mayor, serving as the mayor's senior advisor for citywide lead prevention, the interim chair of NYCHA, the nation's largest public housing authority, and the mayor's food czar, coordinating the delivery of food to the hungry as the COVID-19 pandemic began to devastate the city. Kathryn, thank you so much for being here and talking with me.
It's great to be here, Seth.
So before diving into questions about your positions on various policies, as we always do, I wanted to start just by asking how you and your family have been holding up during the pandemic.
So we have done pretty well, and I'm very happy that my parents and some of my other family members are now vaccinated. But 3 of the 6 grandchildren ended up catching COVID. Luckily, relatively mild cases, and they're all better now. But we still need to be vigilant until everyone is vaccinated.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that the people who had the virus are recovered now, and certainly I wish you and everyone continued health and safety. I want to spend most of today discussing your plans for the city if you're elected mayor, but before jumping into that, I wanted to ask you a question that came to us from one of our patrons in our community, which I found interesting. Mm-hmm. Specifically, the question begins by noting your lengthy tenure in a variety of city agencies and talks about the unique perspective that likely gives you on New York City government. And the questioner goes on to note that you've held these positions under 2 very different mayors, Mayor de Blasio and Mayor Bloomberg, under whom both of us served. Given this, the question that this individual suggested that we ask is the following. So from your unique vantage point inside city government, what do you view as the strengths and the weaknesses of each of these mayors? And what lessons did you take from your experience with both that will guide you if you are elected mayor?
Yes, this is a question I actually get quite frequently, and they are very different. The job of the mayor is to get up every day and work hard for New York City residents and treat them as customers, because that's who they are. Mayor Bloomberg was very data driven. It was actually the way you could get real policy change, and I think visionary on the environment. And I definitely took that with me and continue to hold that as part of my core management. But sometimes data can blind us a little, which I think happened with stop and frisk, where you're looking at numbers and there may not be causality. But But in the de Blasio administration, the real attempt to deal and grapple with equity was important, but execution really lacked. And an ability to bring agencies together, which is a key function of City Hall, because it's through the cracks that we end up not serving New York City residents, things falling between agencies. And there was never any real convening to leverage our different strengths, whether it's not how can sanitation work with PD, or how can sanitation work with homeless services. I know at DEP, when I was there under Bloomberg, there were many conversations about the intersections between, infrastructure and economic development and the public realm that we had all the time. And so those are two very different chief executive mayors.
So moving from your description of how you would govern to what you would actually do. Let's start, if we can, with the economy. And I think it's no secret to anyone that the economy right now is a mess. Even having bounced back from our lows, we're down roughly 500,000 jobs from pre-COVID levels. Our unemployment rate, which pre-COVID had been bouncing around between 3 and 4%, now stands at 12%, which is twice the national average. And on your campaign website, you talk at a high level about your plans to move the city's economy forward. So you talk about rapidly advancing our vaccination efforts and creating pipelines to jobs through CUNY and other institutions, universal broadband, free childcare for working families, Green New Deal, promoting bioscience, and even making it easier for small businesses in the city. And personally, I find it very hard to argue with any of these. But the one thing that I noted as reading through is that maybe with the exception of the vaccination efforts, many of these things are going to take time to implement and take time to start to have an effect. So the question I had for you to start is that if you were elected on the first day in office, what would be, let's say, the 3 things that you would do first that you think would have the most immediate impact on the economic situation in the city?
So, Seth, we absolutely have to open up this economy. We have to give folks guidelines of what's safe and what they can do in a regular and timely manner. But the first piece that I would focus on is restaurants and arts and culture, because that is what differentiates us from the rest of the country, the rest of the world. Supporting those small businesses is transformative very quickly. You get them open, you get them back up and functioning, they will bring back their employees, and that will start the economy. And then that brings your office employees back and brings your tourism back. So we know that small businesses, and particularly art and cultural institutions, need support. There are horrifying statistics that in the cultural sector, we are down 60% in employment. That is the real vibrancy of New York City. It's what makes us special. And so on the first day, that would be my focus, is making sure we're supporting them, whether or not that's access to credit, reducing bureaucracy so that a permit doesn't take you 18 months to get, or promoting them and ensuring that we are promoting these businesses through our advertising outlets.
So since you raised arts and culture, that's obviously a topic that's of interest to us at the 92nd Street Y and much of our patron base. Maybe if you can take a couple of more minutes and drill down on one particular issue. So, the statistics that you cited are certainly alarming, and I've read them as well, the devastation that's occurred in the sector. But we're a city today that's dealing with multiple crises on multiple fronts. Crime is going up, quality of life is falling, we have enormous unemployment, housing insecurity, social injustices. How do you make the argument to the people of the city that arts and culture is something that we should be focusing on day one?
Oh, the way that you make the argument is, first and foremost, if this is a driver of our economy that pulls everything else along, then you do better when they do better. And that's the first argument. The second is we all need outlets for creativity. There's been far too much isolation. And I would postulate that humans don't do well isolated. And acts of creativity and watching creativity are critical to our well-being. But at the end of the day, we bring that sector back, we bring out the restaurant sector back, people start to do better across the city.
Now, so let's say that I'm convinced, and hopefully all of our patrons are convinced by those arguments. I want to go back to what specifically you would do. And I heard what you said about promoting the arts. I heard what you said about reducing bureaucracy and red tape, all of which I think would be enormously helpful, not just for the arts and culture sector, but for businesses more broadly. But one of the challenges that organizations such as ours have is that I guess there are a couple of things. One is that much of our audience has scattered outside of New York. And our hope is that they're going to be coming back, but that's an open question. And then also over the course of the last 11 months or so, we've all been financially devastated by the loss of the ability to operate. And so while promotion would be good, and certainly reducing red tape would be good for organizations, especially smaller organizations that are more vulnerable than, let's say, the 92nd Street Y. The real question is whether they have sufficient capital to even open their doors. So what could the mayor do to help institutions such as that?
Well, first and foremost, I hope that you and all the other institutions in the city finally get access to the Save Our Stages money, which seems stuck at the federal level at this particular moment, which will be, particularly for those who own physical spaces, extremely important. But beyond that, the city can use its ability to borrow money to create capital funds. We have done this before in other areas where we provided low interest loans. And I believe that the financial services world should step up and be a part of that as well. This is their home too, in many respects, and we need to support it.
And so are you proposing that the city would actually be able to provide cash to arts institutions at a moment such as this?
I'm talking about being able to provide loans to institutions such as that. So I think that is my thinking at this time.
Got it. So maybe if we can move out a few clicks in the aperture of the conversation beyond just arts and culture and talk again about the economy as a whole. One of the areas that you focus on in your online platform is the need for us to create more housing and to just encourage development more broadly. And you're running for mayor in a primary in the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party in New York in recent years, at least a part of the Democratic Party has become, let's say, ambivalent about growth and development. And in some corners of the party has actually become hostile. And to a certain extent, it seems like it's understandable why that is. There have been lots of big promises made with big development projects. And from the perspective of many, all that comes out of these development projects are displacement and gentrification. And so I guess a question I have for you is, if you think that development and growth are still important for the future of the city, how would you respond to the people who are concerned about the impact that that might have on the city? And how do you think politically that you could overcome the kind of opposition that sank the Amazon HQ2 in Long Island City or Industry City in Brooklyn in order to advance your agenda?
Yeah, I have a fundamental belief that cities grow or cities die. that you need to be a growing city. And I'm just not nostalgic. I've lived in New York City for 50 years. It's changed. It is not the city of my youth. It's not the city of my young adulthood. And that is actually part of what makes us great. And so I do believe that we need to continue to have growth, because nothing is affordable if you don't have a job. And in terms of housing, we've been dealing with a scarcity problem since before I was born, that there's always been real tightness across the entire housing market, no matter what your income level. And so that is why I think it is important to put that front and center. In many cases, these were unionized jobs. These were jobs that were about having a pathway to the middle class. And so I do think that they're very important. And we do need to reframe the conversation and talk about the people who are impacted, about who was going to get that job. Maybe that's, Ivan, who was going to be the electrician on that particular thing, or it's Joey, who was going to, end up working as a coder in this facility. And also in affordable housing, these are all families. These are families who ended up getting housing that makes it possible for them to have a much better opportunity in school and much better opportunities for employment. The more stable your housing situation, it's foundational. It allows you to do so many other things. And you're right. I believe that the Democratic Party is broader than what we have seen in some election cycles, and that they will be out there and want someone who is capable of getting shit done. And sorry, I hope this isn't on being recorded on a radio station. And also, wants to know that you have a vision, that you're gonna actually be doing the work that they want you to do. And New Yorkers want you to work hard as mayor, and they want you to execute, or they tell you when you haven't gotten it right. But affordability more broadly has been really one of the biggest challenges in the city for probably about the last 20 years. Just the escalation in costs has been astronomical, and getting that back in check a little bit will make it so that there will feel like there isn't displacement in communities, that we can be protective of those communities.
And let me just push, if I can, a little bit on this point, because it sounds to me that from your perspective, the big issue is how we frame the conversation. Do you think that if we just made the arguments better about development and growth, that projects like Amazon in Long Island City would be able to pass? Or is there something more there that we need to do in order for that kind of significant investment in New York City to be met with universal approval, as opposed to what we had, which was division?
Well, Seth, I think universal approval for anything regarding land use in the city of New York is perhaps too high a hill to climb.
That's fair.
But there could have been a lot more done prior to the announcement about engaging with members of the community who ended up being supportive. Queensbridge Houses was supportive by the time the deal fell apart. But none of those validators were in place when it got announced. No one had actually taken the time to talk to them and engage with them prior to this. You can't do development as we're coming in and telling you what the right thing is. You have to make sure that people are at the table. And in the biggest transformation of the private waste sector, which they'd literally been trying to do for 40 years on commercial zoning, we kept everyone at the table that, who might have a possible role. So it was REBNY and BIDS and hospitals and the Environmental Justice Alliance and the, New York Lawyers for the Public Interest and the Teamsters. These are not usually groups that sit at a table and hammer out policy together. And we did that.
So let me transition to another topic that's related to this one, and specifically when it comes to whatever plans it is that you're looking to implement, whether they be economic development plans or housing plans, the budget is going to be a critical piece of the puzzle. And here in New York, we all know that, like the economy, the budget is also something of a mess. And even if this year's budget gets taken care of by federal stimulus dollars, the mayor's own January plan forecasts that the first year you're in office and every year thereafter, for as far as the projections go out, you're going to be facing $4 billion deficits that some budget watchers say are probably more like $5 billion deficits. And then in your own set of proposals, you put forward a number of ambitious goals, which will only cost more money. So you talk about universal childcare for families that earn under $70,000 a year, or creating 50,000 units of affordable housing for low-income families, or 10,000 units of supportive housing for homeless individuals. So I guess the question I have is two things. One, have you thought about how much, or calculated how much, all of the various programs that you're envisioning putting in place would add to that deficit? And then regardless of what that number is, how, and again, with specificity, how do you think that you as mayor would tackle a hole that's that deep?
Well, I mean, it is a deep hole, but as you said, some of the things that I have proposed are capital budget things, and some things are expense budget, so don't actually touch the 5 billion. But on day one, and they should have been doing it already, they should have refinanced all of our debt at 1% to 2%. And by the way, it's alternate sides, so someone didn't move, and that is why you hear honking.
That's New York, right?
That's New York. Yeah, we need to also reduce redundancies. There's been sort of a plethora of offices and agencies that are not working in a coordinated fashion, and we need to streamline. That really will unlock dollars so that we can invest in recovery. But I understand that we've added $50 million to the headquarters budget at Tweed, and that's not money for the classroom.
That's the Department of Education for people
who don't speak in inside City Hall.
Right.
No, I could be Errol Lewis. But there are redundancies, and there is efficiencies to be taken that do not impact sort of the fundamental city service that has to happen, like delivering education to our kids. But it also means, like, we need to make sure that folks are feeling safe in their communities, and the garbage keeps getting picked up, and hopefully the snow is over, but it's still only February. There could be more. And, we really need to be focused on getting very efficient, but also sitting down in labor management and getting productivity savings going forward, so that we're structurally reducing the amount of money it takes to run this government. But there are places where making investment is cheaper in the long run. So for example, you talk about affordable housing. Right now, we pay a tremendous amount of money for the shelter system. Over $2 billion ends up going to the shelter system. Doing two things. One, making the voucher for families closer to market rate would be much smarter than spending money on a shelter. Getting folks off the street and into supportive housing with services so that they can stabilize their life in the long run is cheaper than the Band-Aid we keep putting on it now. So I believe that we need to make strategic long-term investments in the city of New York so that we aren't just constantly trying to catch up to a problem, that we're trying to fix a problem.
But how, in that first year that you're in office, before those strategic long-term investments that you're describing start to pay off, how do you close that $4 billion deficit? I mean, do you think that there's $4 billion in efficiency that we can squeeze out of city government? And like, what does that efficiency look like? Does that mean we're reducing headcount? Does that mean that we're changing work rules? What exactly does that mean?
Right. So I'll give you an example. So when I was at DEP, I cut their operating budget by $100 million. It was 10% of the operating budget without a layoff. And it was looking at every aspect of the operation, from how many people you needed in any particular location to what were you paying for fluoride, and how are we going to get a better deal, and how are we ensuring that that was a reoccurring savings going forward.
And let me ask another maybe delicate question. Do you think that we can close this gap with those kinds of efficiencies alone, and that we don't need revenue enhancement? Or do you think that we're going to need additional revenue as well?
We need to grow the economy. I mean, just going austerity will make it so that our recovery takes longer. So that is why it is so important to also make strategic investments in arts and culture and get us back on our feet so that we have revenue coming back in, so that we are, to use the COVID world, bending the curve. And so you have to do both. I am very concerned about doing a lot of revenue raisers at this moment in time, because our tax base needs to stabilize. And we need people to return, as you said, to be able to be supportive of that tax base. I'm hugely into progressive taxation at a federal level, but when cities and states compete against each other, I think it's a downward spiral, but it's the last tool in the toolbox.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you for that. Let me switch gears to something that you have particular expertise in, and something that our patrons raised, which is one of the comments that was made was that for a campaign that's focused a lot on affordable housing, a topic that seems to be getting too little attention is NYCHA, the Public Housing Authority, which, as you very well know, houses 400,000 of the most vulnerable New Yorkers and suffers from tens of billions of dollars of deferred maintenance. And the question that I have for you is this: on your website, you talk about the fact that your experience with NYCHA says to you that, and this is a quote, "NYCHA doesn't need another plan. Residents have seen plan after plan after plan, including 3 plans under the de Blasio administration. We know what needs to be done, and our focus will be on executing the plan." So can you maybe help our patrons and the city more generally to understand, like, what are the problems at NYCHA, and what is it that you understand and we understand needs to be done, and how do we actually do it?
Sure. NYCHA is at the centerpiece of how I view affordable housing. You can't replace those units. It's 172,000 units of housing for 400,000 residents, literally the size of Miami in size and scope. But it is not surprising that it is in such dire shape. Literally since the 80s, it has gotten systematically underfunded by the federal government. So if they needed $1, they rarely got 90 cents that was actually supposed to come to them. And so things don't get done, and they don't get done. And it's like putting oil in your car. You get to a certain point and the engine blows up. That is where we are today. The engine has blown up. And so they are living in really terrible conditions in many cases across the portfolio, and have about a $40 billion capital need, and have over 400,000 open work orders. It's more than 2 work orders per apartment at this point in time. And there is a plan. The blueprint that has been put out, which uses the federal rental assistance demonstration, which is a public-private partnership that leverages the federal dollars that come in. Usually on studies in other cities, it's about 9-to-1. And literally renovates every single apartment in that development and fixes all of the infrastructure that needs to get fixed, and tenants retain all of their rights. And NYCHA has the ability to go in if anything isn't going right and take it back. So it is a great model for leveraging federal money. And then obviously Greg Rust for dealing with the other 100,000 or so units that need to be rehabbed would do something very similar, but under state law rather than under federal law. And then also leveraging, they have air rights. Let's sell the air rights and put it into the apartments. They have land. Let's build new housing and ensure that that is going to be more additional affordable housing or kicks off income for that development. This is about getting money in a public-private partnership method that can happen now, that is happening. They recently completed 3 developments in the Bronx, Baychester, Murphy, and Betances. Those tenants are proud of where they live now. They want to host Thanksgiving dinner when we all get to do that again. But yes, so this is something where I believe we just need to do this. We need to get this done and not try and shelve it or stop it. Because every time we get a project done, those are families who no longer have mold in their apartments, no longer get stuck in their elevators, no longer have to deal with intercoms that don't work, have heat and hot water. And so I'm a big believer in what is available to us as tools to really make a difference in those residents' lives.
And not to raise the P word again, politics, but I mean, it sounds from what you're saying that it's fairly well understood how we fix this problem. And you gave a few examples of where we're actually using these programs, but there are a ton of examples where we're not. And you talked also about something that's been very controversial, although the idea has been around for a while, of selling air rights or developing on excess land. But politics seems to be, at least from what I've seen, what gets in the way of implementing a lot of these policies. So pretend that you're mayor. What are you going to do to be able to overcome this inertia that has kept us from using what seem to be fairly obvious answers to this really vexing but important problem?
The rental demonstration are actually still moving. Those are just the 3 that were recently completed. They're now done, as well as Ocean Bay and Campos. And that there are a lot more that are in the process, are going through the renovation now across the city. And that just needs to keep moving quickly. I mean, there's some stalls because of COVID, but that is started up again and is moving forward. So I think that is great news. And so as mayor, there are 2 pieces. One of the things that I would do as mayor is at a certain point, they go through a process to select who's going to be the private partner. I would have the tenant association be part of that decision-making process. So they have to buy into who is the partner. Well, you're going to be a partner with them as well. I think that really helps with transparency. But the other piece of it is the more examples of residents who are happy, who want to see this done, the momentum will start to flow. Actually, out in the Rockaways, where one of the first projects was done, there are 2 ocean bays, Bayside and Oceanside. The one that did it said, "I don't want to be in red. I refuse. I believe all of this, sort of rhetoric that, it's all going to be terrible." Now they want to know where they are in the line. Am I getting in? Because they look across the street and they're like, wow, my neighbors have it great and I don't. So when am I getting that? That feeds on itself. You gotta sort of prove it, and you gotta be able to see it.
So a couple of themes that you've raised in that last answer, as well as elsewhere, are the importance of management and the importance of management in ensuring that we can deliver basic city services that are what underlie quality of life in New York City. And one thing that we've heard from several of our patrons is that there's a perception that quality of life under the de Blasio administration has deteriorated, whether it's a greater number of homeless people on the streets, some of whom appear to be mentally ill, or rising crime, or even, according to some people, deteriorating sanitation. And you had a front row seat during the de Blasio administration to the unfolding of all of these issues. And so I guess I have two questions for you. One is, do you think that the perception actually matches reality, or is quality of life declining, or has it declined in recent years? And perhaps more importantly, if you were mayor, what would you do, either if you think that the perception doesn't match reality, to change the perception, or if you do think the perception matches reality, to change the underlying reality?
Yes, and quality of life is key to our recovery. You know, if we open up all the restaurants and nobody comes because they don't feel safe, or they feel like things are dirty, or we don't get new entrepreneurs, these are critical issues. But you need to be looking for the canary in the coal mine of leading indicators, so that you're doing things before. By that, we have known for almost a year that there were issues in the subway. And it wasn't until after the terrible tragedy where 2 people died and were killed on the subway did we flood the subway with cops, and make sure that that was part of our response. But the MTA had been asking for a year for more enforcement and for mental health professionals to be in the system, to be assisting people who were homeless. And there is clear that there are more street homeless today than there were. And that had been rising over time, even under the official counts. And folks had been raising it as a real challenge in their neighborhoods. But we need to engage with people who are experiencing street homeless and get them both into safe haven beds, into supportive beds. And if they won't come in, to try and begin to do drop-in centers to earn that trust again. And I know that the Times Square Alliance is working on that right now, on how to make sure they are engaging with the people who tend to go to Times Square. But we can't allow there to be pop-up cities in our city on the streets. And it's just something that cannot happen. But you gotta get driven by the numbers, and it's sanitation. We took a $100 million budget cut. It impacted cleanliness pretty significantly.
I want to stick to the theme of quality of life and follow the numbers. And one area where the numbers are pretty clear is crime. And you mentioned crime. Murders, I think, were up 40% year over year. Last year, shootings were, I think, double what they had been the previous year. And so there's a concern among many that we're sliding backwards towards the bad old days. But at the same time, there's also another significant issue that we as a city are dealing with, which is the issue of racial injustice and a lack of trust between certain communities and the police force. And in many ways, it feels like the political discourse offers us an either or choice. Either we can have lower crime or we can have racial justice, but we can't have both. And I'm wondering how you as mayor would approach this, and whether you in fact think that it's a zero-sum choice that we have to make between one or the other, or you think that we can in fact have both?
Yeah, I fundamentally reject it's a zero-sum game. We have to be able to walk and chew gum. My brother is Black, his life matters to me, and we need respect from our officers for all of our communities, and we need them to rebuild trust. But we also need them to fight crime and ensure that particularly victims have justice as we move forward. And I believe that I probably have the most experience on how do you get culture change in a uniformed agency? How do you end up changing the dynamic? Because you also get what you measure. If you only measure arrests and 3 arrests a month gives you the opportunity for a promotion, guess what? You're going to get 3 arrests a month. If you measure both, what are the crime stats as well as what are your interactions with the community in a positive way? Did you go by the church? Did you stop by the bakery? That gives you something else that's quantitative that starts to talk about the rebuilding of trust across communities. And I think that is really imperative. But then you've got to promote people off of that. It sends big messages in an agency like PD of who's getting the stars, who's getting that first star, who's getting that second star, and how are they perceived within the organization? And are they viewed as being someone who engages with community? And then those young officers want to model themselves off of it. But I've also recommended that we need to do some things I think are practical. We should recruit officers when they're 25, not 21. 21 is very young still. We should require that new recruits live in the city, which I know requires state law, but is important. So we're all in it together. But we also have to ensure that there's transparency around discipline, that we are getting trust from the public because they know when something bad happens, there will be repercussions. And right now they don't believe that and believe that we need to get rid of the police because even if there's something bad happens, there will be no justice for them. It's a fundamental thing that has to change. And I believe that it needs to really be that accountability needs to sit with the police commissioner and his chain of command to get that done. If you're at sanitation and you take a bribe from a private business and take their garbage, you get fired. Like it's not, that is the end of the line. We don't have a lot of conversation about it. We prove it, you get fired. And that is obviously not anywhere near the level of some of the things we've seen between police and communities. So that is what I would hold my police commissioner accountable for. And you will get change. But you also have to ensure that people are safe, that they are using their data to pinpoint and sort of break this. A lot of this is gang on gang violence going on, and to break that cycle. And then do a little bit of like sussing it. Is this just because these teenagers or this person was really had no other options? I mean, were they shoplifting because they were hungry? Were they in a gang because one of their parents died in COVID? We need to be able to do a little bit more detective work around the drivers so that we can address them and divert people out of the criminal justice system before they end up there.
And seemingly one of the key issues of controversy within the mayoral race right now is the police budget. Where do you fall on the spectrum of candidates between those who think that we should maintain current funding levels and those who think that we should be reducing funding levels?
I believe we need to maintain our patrol numbers, but it is a big agency, and having run big agencies, there might be a few efficiencies to be found. Just maybe I'm going to go there. But the overall patrol strength, I think, needs to stay intact.
Let me end with one final question, which may be the easiest question or maybe the hardest question, depending on how you look at it. But one of the key relationships for any mayor is the relationship between the city and Albany, and in particular between the mayor and the governor. And obviously during this administration, the personal relationship between the mayor and the governor has been fraught. And I guess I would just like to end by asking you, and this was something that a number of our patrons also asked, how would you navigate the institutional city-Albany relationship and the personal mayor-governor relationship?
Yes, I think the mayor and the governor have exhausted us all. And there's a part of me, like, I'm from Brooklyn. I was like, who did what to whose mother? It's so personal. My approach to these types of relationships is just much more pragmatic. I know that I have to be the advocate for New York City, not only with the governor's office, but also with the state legislature. We're going to need things from them, particularly if we want to do big transformative things. We're going to also need to make sure we're advocating for our school funding, that we're advocating for our Medicaid funding as we move forward. So we know that we have to have a strategy in Albany, but I am just inherently a person who can disagree with you without being disagreeable. And there are places where we should work together. The MTA, I want to be as helpful as I can because nobody cares who's in charge. They just want to get to work on time.
Great. Well, Kathryn, there's so much more for us to discuss, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you so much for sharing your plans for the city with all of us. To our 92nd Street Y patrons, thank you for supporting and tuning in to the race to City Hall. Please check back on our website for the most up-to-date schedule of future conversations. And in the meantime, from the virtual stage of the 92nd Street Y, we're signing off. We appreciate your joining us very much.